Good evening and welcome. Tonight we slowly step into a different world, a world of marble and blood, senate halls and battlefield dust, whispered alliances and irreversible decisions. In this story we will explore Julius Caesar, the man who crossed the line, and uncover how one restless aristocrat, driven by an intolerance for insignificance, reshaped Rome from republic to empire, bending institutions, loyalty, and even time itself to his will. This is not only a story of conquest, it is a story of ambition under pressure, of a system already cracking, of a man who refused to shrink when the world told him to step back. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Now settle in, take a slow breath, and let's cross the Rubicon. Rome did not whisper, it roared. By the time Gaius Julius Caesar was born in 100 BCE, the Republic was already cracking under its own ambition. Senators strutted through marble halls pretending to be humble servants of the state while quietly calculating whose throat needed cutting next. Generals came home from foreign wars not just with gold, but with loyalty, personal loyalty, the most dangerous kind. Into this unstable theater, a child was born, not into poverty, not into supreme power either, into something more psychologically complicated, declining nobility. Caesar's family, the Julii, claimed descent from Iulus, the son of Aeneas, yes, that Aeneas, the Trojan hero, which meant by mythic extension that they traced their bloodline back to the goddess Venus herself. Imagine growing up with that story attached to your name. You are not just a boy, you are divine potential. But here is the tension. By the time Caesar was born, the Julii were ancient but politically unimpressive. They had prestige without dominance, a glorious surname without current relevance. In Rome, that is humiliation disguised as honor, and children feel that. They feel when their family name gets polite respect instead of fear. They feel when others outrank them. They feel when legacy is heavier than reality. Caesar grew up in the Suburra, a crowded, noisy district of Rome, not the polished elite hilltops. The Suburra was alive with merchants, shouting vendors, immigrants, gamblers, ambition. It smelled like sweat and possibility. It was the perfect psychological incubator. He was raised between two worlds. The aristocratic myth of his bloodline. The gritty reality of Roman street politics. That contradiction creates hunger. His father, Gaius Julius Caesar the Elder, was a praetor, respectable but not revolutionary. His mother, Orliacata, however, was formidable, intelligent, disciplined, socially astute. Ancient historians quietly agree she shaped him. If you want to understand Caesar, understand this. He grew up watching power closely, and he grew up watching it from slightly outside its center. That position does something to a mind. When you are born at the very top, you defend your position. When you are born at the very bottom, you fight to survive. But when you are born just beneath true dominance, you obsess over ascent. Rome during Caesar's childhood was politically violent. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla had drenched the city in blood. Proscriptions, official kill lists circulated. Wealth was confiscated. Allies turned informant overnight. Young Caesar would have absorbed a simple lesson. Power in Rome is temporary, unless you seize it fully. His aunt Julia was married to Gaius Marius, the great general and enemy of Sulla. This connection would later nearly cost Caesar his life, but at this stage it gave him proximity to greatness. He could observe how military glory translated into political leverage. He saw that soldiers did not just win wars, they rewrote politics. When his father died suddenly in 85 BCE, Caesar was just 16. And with that death, childhood ended. Roman society did not cradle grief, it assigned responsibility. He became head of the household, paused there for a moment, 16, responsible for family prestige, finances, political alliances, reputation. This is where ambition stops being abstract and becomes survival. Shortly after, Caesar made his first defining move. He married Cornelia, daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a powerful ally of Marius and enemy of Sulla. It was not a love story, it was positioning, and then Sulla won. When Sulla marched on Rome and declared himself dictator, he began purging enemies. Caesar, tied by marriage to the Marian faction, was ordered to divorce Cornelia. Most young men would have complied. Divorce the girl, save your life, live to fight another day. Caesar refused. Psychologically, this is revealing. Was it loyalty, pride, calculation, likely all three? By refusing Sulla, he risked execution. His property was confiscated, his priesthood stripped. He went into hiding. This is the first time Caesar gambled against death, and he learned something critical. Fear can be negotiated. Friends intervened. Influential relatives pleaded his case. Eventually, Sulla relented grudgingly, but not before allegedly warning. There are many Mariuses in this boy. A translation, Sulla saw the danger, the hunger, the potential for disruption. Caesar survived, but survival did not soften him, it sharpened him. Exile followed, military service in Asia Minor, exposure to war, exposure to command structures, exposure to how authority feels when men obey instantly. There is a psychological shift that happens the first time you give an order and it is carried out. It rewires you. Around this time, he was captured by pirates in the Aegean Sea. And here is where we see the core of the man emerging. The pirates demanded ransom. Caesar reportedly laughed at the amount, insisting they demand more because he was worth more. Even in captivity, he performed superiority. He joined their games, mocked them, promised he would crucify them once freed. They thought it was charming arrogance. After his ransom was paid, he raised a fleet, hunted them down, and crucified them. Mercifully, he slit their throats first. There is something chillingly instructive in that episode. Humiliation did not diminish him. It fueled retaliation. He refused to internalize powerlessness. Back in Rome, he pursued rhetoric, studied under Apollonius Maulon in Rhodes, the same teacher who had trained Cicero. Caesar understood something early. In Rome, persuasion was weaponry. A general commands soldiers. An orator commands minds, and Caesar wanted both. Physically, he was not imposing in the traditional Roman sense. He suffered from epilepsy. He was meticulous about grooming, sensitive about balding later in life, which is fascinating. Men insecure about appearance often compensate socially. They become charismatic, strategic, magnetic. Caesar crafted himself carefully. He wept publicly at the statue of Alexander the Great while stationed in Spain years later, lamenting that Alexander had conquered the world by 30 while he had done nothing remarkable. That story matters, not because of its literal accuracy, but because of what it reveals. He compared himself to legends. He measured his life against immortality. That is not normal ambition. That is myth-level expectation. By his early 20s, the essential ingredients were set. Noble lineage with fading influence. Exposure to political bloodshed. Direct defiance of a dictator. Experience of exile and danger. Public speaking training. A growing awareness that reputation is everything. And underneath all of it, a restless dissatisfaction, Rome was not enough as it was. He did not want to participate in the system. He wanted to bend it. The boy from the Subura with divine ancestry and near execution in his past had already learned the central lesson of Roman power. If you do not dominate the narrative, you become a footnote in someone else's. And Caesar had no intention of being a footnote. Pause threes. He was not yet the conqueror of Gaul, not yet the man who would cross the Rubicon, not yet the dictator whose name would become a title. He was simply a young aristocrat with dangerous levels of self-belief. But if you look closely, the pattern is already there: the refusal to submit, the strategic marriages, the theatrical confidence in front of pirates, the sensitivity to legacy, the hunger to be compared with Alexander, the quiet, burning idea: I am meant for more. And Rome, volatile, paranoid, magnificent Rome, was the perfect stage. But a stage is useless without an audience. And Caesar understood something before most men his age even understood themselves. Power in Rome did not belong to the strongest man. It belonged to the most visible one. He returned to Rome not as a general, not as a hero, but as a young noble with scars you couldn't see. He had survived Sulla. He had defied orders. He had tasted captivity and retaliation, but survival is not status. Survival is only the entry fee. So he began crafting something far more durable than survival: reputation. His early political career was not marked by dominance. It was marked by bold positioning. He aligned himself with the populars, the faction that claimed to represent the common people, rather than the conservative senatorial elite, the optimates. This was not purely ideological. It was psychological strategy. The aristocracy already had its champions, but the masses, the urban poor, the restless veterans, they were emotionally volatile and politically powerful if mobilized. Caesar chose to be their voice. He delivered speeches that attacked corruption. He prosecuted former governors for extortion. He made enemies early and publicly. That was not accidental. In Rome, being attacked by the elite could be reframed as proof that you threatened them. And threatening entrenched power is intoxicating to an audience. But here is where it becomes interesting. He spent money he did not have: lavish games, public feasts, architectural projects, religious ceremonies executed with theatrical grandeur. When he was elected aedile in 65 BCE, he staged games so extravagant that Rome had never seen their equal. Exotic animals, massive crowds, visual spectacle on a scale bordering on reckless. He went into crushing debt to do it. Most men fear debt because it restricts freedom. Caesar weaponized debt. Debt forced him forward. Debt made retreat impossible. Debt ensured that he could not afford to be mediocre. Every coin he borrowed became psychological pressure: rise higher or collapse completely. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome, quietly backed him. Crassus understood ambition when he saw it, and Caesar understood leverage. Their relationship was transactional but symbiotic. Crassus supplied financial oxygen. Caesar supplied future political potential. At the same time, Caesar pursued religious authority. He ran for Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. It was a lifetime appointment, prestigious beyond measure. He faced older, more experienced candidates. On the morning of the election, he reportedly told his mother Aurelia that he would return home either as Pontifex Maximus or not at all. That sentence tells you everything. He did not think in incremental steps. He thought in absolutes. He won at just 37 years old. The office granted him not only religious authority, but also residence in the Forum itself, the heart of Roman political life. Symbolically, he had moved from the Subura's crowded streets to the epicenter of power. Physically and psychologically, he was now embedded in Rome's core. But ambition without alliance is fragile. Rome was a web of egos. Pompey the Great was Rome's most celebrated general, fresh from eastern conquests. Crassus possessed unimaginable wealth. The Senate distrusted both. Each man alone was powerful. Together, they could override the Republic's machinery. Caesar saw the geometry before anyone else. In 60 BCE, he engineered the first triumvirate, an informal political alliance between himself, Pompey, and Crassus. It was not constitutional. It was not legal in any formal sense. It was personal power consolidated against institutional resistance. Think about the psychology here. Pompey had glory. Crassus had money. Caesar had momentum. He offered each man what the other withheld. He married his daughter Julia to Pompey, binding alliance with blood. He negotiated compromises that made each partner feel advantaged. But beneath the surface, Caesar was doing something subtler. He was placing himself at the intersection of their interests. If Pompey and Crassus distrusted each other, and they did, Caesar became the bridge. Remove the bridge, and the alliance collapsed. Made himself indispensable. In 59 BCE, he was elected consul. The Senate resisted him at every turn, so he bypassed them. He brought legislation directly to the popular assemblies. He humiliated opponents publicly. His co-consul Bibulus attempted obstruction, declaring unfavorable omens to halt political proceedings. Caesar ignored him. When Bibulus retreated from public life in protest, Romans joked that they were living in the consulship of Julius and Caesar. Mockery is a sign of dominance. After his consulship, Caesar secured a governorship in Gaul. On paper, it was administrative. In reality, it was opportunity. Military command meant legions. Legions meant loyalty. Loyalty meant future leverage. Gaul was not yet the legend it would become. It was fragmented territory, tribes, rivalries, shifting alliances. What Caesar saw was not chaos, he saw narrative space. Rome feared Gallic incursions. Rome respected conquest. If he could present himself as defender and conqueror simultaneously, he could rewrite his stature entirely. And this is where his psychological genius sharpened. He did not merely fight in Gaul, he documented it. His Commentarii de Bello Gallico was not neutral history, it was strategic storytelling. Written in crisp third-person prose, it portrayed him as rational, restrained, necessary. Every brutal siege was framed as defensive, every massacre contextualized as response. He was not expanding ambition, he was stabilizing chaos. He controlled how Rome perceived him. Victories followed. The Helvetii were defeated. Ariovistus pushed back, the Belgae subdued. Bridges built across the Rhine in engineering feats designed as much for intimidation as utility. An expedition to Britain brief but symbolically immense. Each campaign layered myth onto his persona. His soldiers adored him, not because he was distant, but because he shared hardship. He marched beside them, ate with them, remembered names, rewarded bravery publicly. Discipline was strict, but loyalty was reciprocal. When legions feel seen, they become extensions of one will. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the political equilibrium began to fracture. Julia, his daughter and Pompey's wife, died in childbirth. The emotional bond between Caesar and Pompey weakened. Crassus died in 53 BCE during a disastrous campaign against Parthia. Triangular balance collapsed into a line. 2 men remained, and Rome does not tolerate 2 sons. The Senate, increasingly wary of Caesar's growing fame, aligned with Pompey. They demanded Caesar relinquish command and return to Rome as a private citizen before standing for another consulship. On the surface, it was procedural. In reality, it was a trap. Without his legions and immunity, he would be vulnerable to prosecution. Political annihilation disguised as legal order. This was the moment. Years of ambition, debt, alliance, narrative building, all narrowing to a single decision. Submit and survive politically diminished, or defy and risk everything. In 49 BCE, standing at the Rubicon River, the legal boundary his army could not cross without committing treason, Caesar paused. We do not know the exact length of that pause, but psychologically it must have been immense. Crossing meant civil war, blood of Romans by Roman hands, no plausible deniability, no retreat into technicalities. He crossed. Alia iacta est, the die is cast. It is often romanticized as spontaneous bravado. It was not. It was cumulative inevitability. Every debt, every speech, every alliance, every victory in Gaul had made neutrality impossible. He had built himself into a figure too large to shrink quietly. Civil war unfolded swiftly. Pompey retreated east. Many senators fled with him. Caesar moved fast, securing Italy with minimal resistance, demonstrating clemency to captured opponents. That clemency was strategic. Mercy creates obligation. Executions create martyrs. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, Caesar's smaller force defeated Pompey's army. It was decisive. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered before Caesar arrived. Presented with Pompey's severed head, Caesar reportedly wept. Whether genuine grief or political theater, it reinforced his image. He defeated enemies, but he did not revel in Roman blood. From hunted youth under Sulla to master of Rome's fate. But power, once seized, demands consolidation. He became dictator not once but repeatedly, culminating in appointment as dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. Honors accumulated, statues erected, his face on coins, an unprecedented assertion in a republic allergic to monarchy. Reforms flowed, calendar restructuring, debt relief, provincial reorganization, expansion of the Senate. Some reforms were pragmatic, some were visionary, some were provocative, and perception began to shift. To supporters, he was stabilizer of chaos. To critics, he was king in all but name, and Rome did not forgive kings. But that reckoning belongs to another chapter. What matters here is the transformation. The boy who grew up between divine ancestry and political insignificance had engineered his ascent through calculated risk. He understood narrative. He understood spectacle. He understood that loyalty is cultivated through shared hardship. He understood that debt can be fuel. He understood that mercy can be weaponized. Most importantly, he understood that hesitation, prolonged, becomes weakness. So he rarely hesitated for long. Pause 3. By the time Rome realized how thoroughly he had reshaped its political gravity, it was already orbiting him. And men who believe they are defending a republic often convince themselves that removing one man will restore balance. They are usually wrong, but they always act. The die was cast, but dice once thrown don't stop midair, they land. And when they land, consequences begin breathing. Pompey was dead, the Senate scattered. Rome, confused, exhausted, war-torn, looked to the only man still standing with coherence and momentum, Caesar. He did not immediately crown himself in spectacle. That would have been crude. Instead, he moved with calculated calm. He offered pardons. He invited former enemies back into political life. Brutus, Cassius. Men who would later raise blades against him were welcomed, restored, forgiven. Understand the psychological brilliance of that. When you spare a defeated rival, you force him into an identity crisis. He must now choose between gratitude and pride, between loyalty and humiliation. Mercy can feel like superiority, and superiority breeds resentment. Caesar believed clemency would stabilize Rome, but clemency also destabilizes egos. He was named dictator multiple times, short terms at first, technically constitutional emergency powers. Rome had used dictators before in moments of crisis. The position was meant to be temporary, a reset button, but Rome's crises were no longer temporary. In 46 BCE, after further campaigns in Africa and Spain to eliminate Pompeian resistance, Caesar returned to Rome for a series of triumphs, lavish military parades celebrating victory. Gold flooded the streets, prisoners marched in chains, exotic animals displayed. The spectacle was overwhelming. He understood something fundamental. Exhausted populations are soothed by grandeur. Victory distracts from fear. And then came the reforms. The Julian calendar, arguably one of his most lasting legacies, restructured time itself. Imagine the audacity. Not merely changing laws, changing the measurement of existence, months rebalanced, leap years introduced, administrative efficiency imposed on cosmic rhythm. Time bent slightly toward Caesar. He expanded the Senate from around 600 members to 900. On the surface, inclusion, in practice, dilution. By flooding the body with new members, many loyal to him, he weakened the old aristocratic guard's dominance. He settled veterans on land across the provinces, ensuring loyalty beyond Italy. He restructured debt without triggering collapse. He initiated public works projects that employed thousands. These were not random acts, they were systemic recalibrations. But power accumulation is a psychological mirror. The more authority one acquires, the harder it becomes to perceive threat accurately. Honors began to stack uncomfortably high, a golden chair in the Senate, a laurel wreath worn constantly, a statue among the kings of Rome, his face stamped on coins while he was still alive, an act bordering on monarchic symbolism. He was named Dictator Perpetuo in 44 BCE for life, and that phrase echoed. Rome had expelled its last king nearly 5 centuries earlier. The Republic was built on that trauma. The word rex, king, was radioactive. Even suggestion of monarchy triggered ancestral memory. Caesar insisted he did not seek kingship, and perhaps consciously he did not. But symbolism does not care about intention. Perception is reality in political ecosystems. The Lupercalia festival offered a revealing moment. Mark Antony publicly attempted to place a diadem, a royal headband, on Caesar's head. The crowd reacted uncertainly. Caesar refused it. Twice was it staged, a test of public appetite, a genuine refusal. Historians still debate, but psychologically it exposed something fragile. He needed to know how close he could step toward monarchy without igniting revolt. And the answer was not that close. Behind closed doors, whispers intensified. Senators convinced themselves that they were not ambitious, they were protectors, that they were not envious, they were preserving liberty. That assassination was not murder, it was surgery. Conspiracies are rarely built on pure malice. They are constructed from rationalizations. Brutus, descendant of the man who had expelled Rome's last king, became symbolically crucial. If Brutus joined, the plot could be framed not as jealousy, but as patriotism. Caesar, meanwhile, appeared increasingly insulated, surrounded by loyalists, elevated physically above others in ceremony. When warned of threats, he dismissed them. When given lists of potential conspirators, he did not open them immediately. Overconfidence is subtle. It doesn't feel like arrogance from inside, it feels like inevitability. On the morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, Rome felt ordinary. That is how history often disguises itself. Caesar's wife Calpurnia reportedly dreamt of his statue bleeding. She urged him not to attend the Senate session. For a moment, he considered staying home. That hesitation matters. Even dominant figures feel premonition, but Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators, persuaded him otherwise. To stay home would appear fearful, weak. A dictator cannot project vulnerability, so he went. The Senate meeting was held not in the usual curia but in the theater of Pompey, an irony thick with symbolism. Pompey's statue loomed nearby. As Caesar took his seat, the conspirators closed in under pretense of petition. One grabbed his toga, another struck first. Blades followed in rapid succession. Chaos compresses time. We imagine dramatic pauses, final speeches. Reality is faster, confused, physical. 23 stab wounds. He reportedly resisted until he saw Brutus among them. Whether he said et tu, Brute, remains debated. But the psychological betrayal was real regardless of wording. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue, blood pooling beneath the stone likeness of his former rival. The conspirators expected applause. They expected citizens to rally. They expected restoration of the Republic. Instead, Rome froze. Assassination does not rewind political momentum. It detonates it. Mark Antony seized the moment. At Caesar's funeral, he delivered a speech that reframed the narrative entirely. He read Caesar's will aloud, revealing that the dictator had left money to every Roman citizen and opened his private gardens for public use. Generosity from the grave. The crowd shifted emotionally from uncertainty to fury. The conspirators, who had imagined themselves liberators, became targets. Civil war resumed, not to restore the old republic, but to determine who would inherit Caesar's vacuum. And here lies the final psychological twist. They killed the man, but they could not kill the myth. Caesar had adopted his grandnephew Octavian in his will, a quiet, seemingly unimpressive young man, but adoption in Rome was political rebirth. Octavian became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, heir not only to wealth but to name. Name is power. Octavian understood branding as instinctively as his adoptive father. He aligned with Mark Antony and Lepidus in the Second Triumvirate, legally formalizing what Caesar's earlier alliance had improvised. They hunted down the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius fell at Philippi. The Republic did not restore itself. Instead, years later, Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra, consolidating power and taking a new title, Augustus. Rome did not call him king, it called him princeps, first citizen. Language adjusted, reality remained, the Republic became empire, and at the center of that transformation stands the shadow of one man. Here is the paradox of Julius Caesar. He did not live to see emperors. But without him, emperors would not exist. He destabilized norms so completely that restoration was impossible. He concentrated loyalty in individuals rather than institutions. He demonstrated that military charisma could override senatorial tradition. He normalized lifelong authority. His assassination was meant to prevent monarchy. It ensured it. Pause threes. So who was he really? A reformer, yes. A populist, certainly. A manipulator of narrative, absolutely. A man hungry for immortality, without question. But beneath titles and triumphs was still that boy from the Subura, raised on divine ancestry and political insecurity. A young man who once compared himself to Alexander and found himself lacking. A politician who refused to divorce when threatened by a dictator. A captive who laughed at pirates and then crucified them. He built himself through risk. He escalated when cornered. He blurred mercy and dominance. And in the end, he miscalculated one thing: how fragile elite pride can become when permanently eclipsed. History rarely belongs to the cautious. It belongs to those willing to cross rivers knowing there is no return. Caesar crossed his. Rome followed, and the world has lived in the consequences ever since. But Rome did not heal. When a system loses its central gravitational force, everything begins drifting violently. After Caesar's assassination, there was no clean restoration of the Republic, only a scramble to control the vacuum he left behind. And vacuums do not stay empty for long. Mark Antony moved first. He secured Caesar's papers, his treasury, his political momentum. In public, he positioned himself as the defender of Caesar's legacy. In private, he understood that legacy was a ladder and he intended to climb. But then the will was opened, and a quiet 18-year-old stepped into history, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted son. It is difficult to overstate how shocking this was to Rome's power players. Octavian was young, sickly-looking, politically untested. Antony underestimated him immediately. Most did, but they forgot something fundamental. He had inherited the name, and in Rome, names carried armies. When Octavian arrived in Italy, he did something psychologically brilliant. He did not demand authority. He claimed inheritance. He presented himself not as competitor, but as continuation. He paid the monetary gifts Caesar had promised to the citizens, using borrowed money if necessary. That act alone reframed him from boy to rightful successor. Meanwhile, the conspirators, Brutus, Cassius, and their allies fled east, gathering forces. They believed time would legitimize their act, that Rome would eventually thank them. They misunderstood public emotion. People rarely thank those who destabilize their lives, even in the name of liberty. Antony and Octavian circled each other warily at first. Antony had experience, charisma, and veterans. Octavian had legality of adoption and growing popular sympathy. Neither trusted the other. Both needed each other. In 43 BCE, they formed the second triumvirate with Lepidus. Unlike Caesar's earlier alliance, this one was official, legally sanctioned with extraordinary powers for 5 years. And then came the proscriptions. If Sulla's lists had been brutal decades earlier, this was colder. Names posted publicly, property confiscated, enemies executed. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and vocal critic of Antony, was among them. He was hunted down and killed, his head and hands displayed in the Forum. This was not reform, this was consolidation through fear. Octavian approved these measures. That matters. The young heir of Caesar learned quickly. Mercy may inspire loyalty, but fear eliminates opposition. Together, the triumvirs marched east to confront Brutus and Cassius. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, the assassins were defeated. Both died by suicide. With them died the last serious claim that Caesar's murder would restore the Republic, but alliances built on necessity rarely survive success. Lepidus was gradually sidelined, politely at first, then permanently. That left two, Octavian in the west, Antony in the east. Antony gravitated toward Egypt and Cleopatra. Cleopatra was not merely a romantic distraction as later propaganda would paint her. She was intelligent, politically sharp, and fully aware of Rome's fractures. Antony aligned himself with her both personally and strategically. Together, they represented a powerful Eastern bloc, but optics matter, and Octavian mastered optics. He framed Antony not as rival, but as traitor, as a man bewitched by a foreign queen, as someone who intended to shift Rome's center of gravity toward Alexandria. He publicized Antony's will, revealing alleged intentions to distribute Roman territories to Cleopatra's children. Whether exaggerated or not, it worked. Rome does not tolerate divided loyalty. In 31 BCE, at the naval battle of Actium, Octavian's forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra. They fled to Egypt. Within a year, both were dead, suicides that closed the last chapter of Caesar's immediate aftermath. Octavian returned to Rome not as dictator. He had studied what happened to the last man who took that title permanently. Instead, in 27 BCE, he executed a masterstroke. He theatrically restored the Republic, handing powers back to the Senate. The Senate, grateful and strategically dependent, handed them back to him under new titles. Augustus, princeps, first citizen, no crown, no declaration of monarchy, but absolute authority wrapped in republican language. And this is where Caesar's true legacy crystallizes. He had broken the Republic's psychological ceiling. Before Caesar, lifelong dominance was unthinkable. After Caesar, it was merely rebranded. Augustus ruled for decades. Stability returned. Expansion continued. Administration professionalized. The Roman Empire, though not yet called that explicitly, was born. And every emperor who followed bore a title derived from one man's name. Caesar, it became a designation of power. Kaiser, Tsar, Caesar. His identity outlived his body by millennia. But let's step back. Strip away empire, strip away myth. What patterns defined Julius Caesar's arc? First, relentless escalation. At every crossroads, he chose the path that expanded his agency rather than preserved safety. Refusing Sulla, overspending as Aedile, forging the triumvirate, crossing the Rubicon, accepting dictatorship for life. Each decision increased risk, but also increased narrative dominance. Second, mastery of perception. From his Gallic commentaries to public mercy toward enemies, he curated how Rome saw him. He understood that legitimacy is often a story told convincingly enough times. Third, personal loyalty over institutional loyalty. His soldiers fought for him. Citizens adored him. Veterans settled because of him. This shift from loyalty to Senate and Republic toward loyalty to individuals irreversibly altered Roman political psychology. Fourth, symbolic sensitivity. He knew when to display generosity, when to parade triumph, when to build bridges as spectacle. But near the end, symbolism slipped beyond his control. The golden chair, the laurel crown, the perpetual dictatorship. He underestimated how deeply Rome's anti-monarchical reflex still pulsed. And finally, ambition fused with insecurity. That young man who once wept before a statue of Alexander never stopped measuring himself against immortality. His achievements were extraordinary, yet they were also driven by an internal refusal to be ordinary. He did not merely want victory. He wanted permanence. Ironically, he achieved it through death. Because martyrdom is a powerful accelerant. Had he retired quietly, perhaps the Republic might have staggered on longer. But assassination froze him in myth. It removed the possibility of decline. He became forever ascending, never aging into failure. There is a lesson buried here, uncomfortable but real. Systems rarely collapse because of one man. They collapse because structures were already fragile, and one man exposed the fractures. By Caesar's time, the Republic was strained by expansion, wealth inequality, military loyalty to generals, and political gridlock. He did not create these tensions. He navigated them more effectively than anyone else. And when others tried to reverse that navigation with knives, they accelerated the transformation they feared. Imagine Rome without Caesar. No Rubicon crossed, no Gallic myth-making. No calendar reform, no Augustus rising under his name. History would be unrecognizable. Yet imagine Caesar without Rome. His ambition might have withered in a smaller state. His narrative genius might have remained provincial. His hunger required a stage vast enough to justify it. They shaped each other, a volatile republic, and a man who refused to remain small within it. By the time Augustus solidified power, the Roman world had accepted a new normal. Stability mattered more than old constitutional purity. Bread, peace, expansion, these were tangible. Abstract liberty was harder to feel. And so the empire endured for centuries, all because one young noble from the Subura believed he was meant for more and acted accordingly, repeatedly, irrevocably. History remembers his assassins as cautionary. It remembers his heir as foundational, but it remembers him as catalytic. Julius Caesar did not live to see emperors crowned. He became the prototype they could never escape. The Republic feared kings. It produced one anyway, just without the title. And that may be the most Roman ending possible. Augustus ruled. The empire stabilized. Marble replaced brick. Borders hardened. Legions professionalized. And yet, even as Rome settled into imperial rhythm, there was a ghost in the architecture. Caesar. Not the aging dictator stabbed beneath Pompey's statue, not the controversial reformer, but the symbol, and symbols are more powerful than policies. From this point forward, no ruler of Rome could escape comparison to him. Every general who won a victory heard whispers. Every ambitious senator felt the gravitational pull of precedent. Every emperor inherited not just power, but a psychological blueprint. Let's examine what that blueprint actually was, because Julius Caesar did something subtle and irreversible. He changed what Romans believed was possible. Before him, the Republic functioned on competitive limitation. Power rotated, offices expired, authority was fragmented deliberately to prevent dominance. Ambition was expected, but it was meant to stay within invisible boundaries. Caesar erased the boundaries, not in a single act, but through cumulative normalization. First, extended military command in Gaul beyond traditional expectations. Then personal loyalty from legions over Senate allegiance. Then crossing into Italy under arms, then repeated dictatorships, then perpetual dictatorship. Each step adjusted the acceptable range of authority. Humans adapt quickly to new normals. What shocks at first becomes tolerable when repeated. Caesar's genius was pacing. He did not declare monarchy on day one. He moved incrementally, always slightly ahead of resistance, never dramatically beyond it until the very end. By the time elites panicked, he was already indispensable. This pattern became instructional. Augustus absorbed it fully. He avoided the mistakes. Where Caesar accepted overt honors, Augustus refused them publicly while consolidating them privately. Where Caesar allowed visible symbols of monarchy, Augustus cloaked authority in humility. But make no mistake, the structural transformation began with Caesar. And this is where we shift from narrative to psychology again. Why does one man break systems while others merely operate inside them? It is not intelligence alone. Rome had brilliant minds. It is not military skill alone. Rome had countless competent generals. It is not even ambition alone. The Senate was filled with ambitious men. It is a particular combination. Extreme self-belief, high tolerance for risk, narrative control, emotional intelligence with masses, a calculated disregard for institutional restraint. Caesar possessed all five, but there was also something more fragile underneath. He could not endure irrelevance. That is the thread from youth to death. When Sulla ordered divorce, he refused. When pirates captured him, he mocked them. When overshadowed by Pompey, he forged alliance. When blocked by Senate, he bypassed them. When faced with political diminishment, he crossed the Rubicon. Retreat felt like annihilation, and here lies the quiet tragedy. Men who cannot tolerate decline often accelerate their own destruction. By accepting dictatorship for life, he forced Rome's elite into existential panic. Had he paused, stepped back, redistributed authority symbolically, he might have survived. But survival without dominance may have felt like internal death to him, so he chose visible permanence, and permanence triggered blades. Now let's consider his legacy not as mythology, but as structure. The Julian calendar lasted over 1,600 years before minor adjustments created the Gregorian system we use today. His administrative reforms strengthened provincial integration. His expansion into Gaul permanently Romanized vast territories that would shape Western Europe's linguistic and cultural identity. France, parts of Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, these regions entered Roman orbit because of him. Latin spread, infrastructure followed, urbanization accelerated. Even the concept of centralized executive authority in later European states owes intellectual lineage to Rome's imperial model, an imperial model born from republican collapse catalyzed by Caesar. And culturally, he became archetype. Shakespeare immortalized him. Medieval rulers invoked him. Modern leaders are still compared to him when they challenge institutional norms. His name evolved into title across civilizations. That is mythic endurance. HS simplify. The real Caesar was contradictory. Merciful but ruthless, populist but aristocratic, strategic but impulsive, charismatic but capable of cold calculation. He could inspire devotion in soldiers and paranoia in senators simultaneously. He built loyalty through shared hardship, yet ultimately distanced himself in symbolic elevation. He wrote his own propaganda, yet likely believed in it sincerely. He was not a cartoon tyrant, nor was he pure visionary hero. He was adaptive, and adaptation in volatile systems often looks like opportunism to opponents. Let's return briefly to that young Caesar staring at Alexander's statue. He wept because he feared inadequacy. He feared dying unknown. That fear drove everything, and Atres the paradox. In trying to avoid obscurity, he ensured immortality but lost longevity. Had he been less ambitious, he might have lived longer. Had he been less dominant, he might have preserved the Republic slightly longer. But had he been less driven, we would not be speaking of him now. History rewards extremity. Moderation rarely echoes for 2,000 years. So what do we actually learn from him? First, institutions are only as strong as the incentives they create. Rome incentivized military glory and personal loyalty. Caesar maximized both. Second, narrative matters as much as action. His commentaries shaped perception as effectively as his legions shaped territory. Third, power consolidation invites existential fear. When elites believe they face permanent marginalization, they will risk chaos to prevent it. Fourth, assassination does not restore systems, it destabilizes them further. And finally, ambition without internal sealing is transformative but combustible. Caesar did not intend to end the Republic, but he could not imagine shrinking himself to preserve it, and that inability altered world history. Augustus learned from his adoptive father's strengths and mistakes. He institutionalized one-man rule more subtly. He ensured succession planning. He cultivated the appearance of shared governance while retaining final authority. In that sense, Caesar was both founder and cautionary tale. the Republic died in stages. Caesar delivered the decisive blow, but the empire that followed carried his DNA. Even centuries later, emperors invoked his name for legitimacy. Even in collapse, Rome remembered him. And here is perhaps the most fascinating psychological layer of all. Caesar did not just conquer territory, he conquered imagination. When people think of Rome, they often think first of him, even before Augustus, even before Trajan, even before Constantine. Why? Because he represents transition, and humans are captivated by turning points. Stable eras blur, revolutions burn into memory. Caesar was fire. He did not merely participate in Roman history, he pivoted it. Picture the Forum long after his death, statues erected, busts carved. His name spoken with reverence, resentment, awe. Young senators walking across stones he once crossed, whispering comparisons, asking themselves quietly, would I dare what he dared? Would I cross my own Rubicon? That question has outlived empires, and it is why Julius Caesar remains psychologically present even now. He is not remembered only because he ruled. He is remembered because he refused limitation, because he escalated when pressured, because he embodied the dangerous idea that one individual sufficiently bold can override a centuries-old system. Sometimes that idea creates progress, sometimes it creates collapse. In Rome's case, it created both. And somewhere beyond myth and marble, beyond laurel wreaths and senate floors, beyond daggers and diadems, there remains the image of a young man from a fading noble house standing in a crowded district of Rome, convinced that ordinary life would be a betrayal of his potential. He was right, but the cost of being extraordinary is rarely paid only by the individual. Rome paid it too, and the world inherited the result, but history did not close the book. Because Caesar's story does something unusual, it keeps resurfacing whenever power tilts too far toward one individual. Centuries passed. Emperors rose and fell, some brilliant, some unstable, some forgettable. Yet the pattern remained. Legitimacy in Rome now flowed downward from a single apex. Even when emperors pretended otherwise, the architecture of authority had been permanently redesigned, and redesigns outlived designers. What makes Caesar enduring is not just that he seized power, it's that he exposed how fragile the old system already was. The Roman Republic liked to imagine itself balanced, consuls checking each other, Senate guiding policy, assemblies voting, tribunes protecting the people. But by the 1st century BCE, expansion had outgrown governance. Wealth disparities widened. Generals returned from campaigns with armies personally loyal to them rather than the state. Political obstruction became strategy instead of disagreement. The Republic was built for a city-state. It was now ruling an empire. Caesar did not invent this mismatch. He exploited it more effectively than anyone else. That distinction matters. When people ask whether he destroyed the Republic, the deeper answer is this: he proved it could be destroyed. Once that proof exists, it can never be erased. Let's zoom in psychologically one last time. What separates a reformer from a revolutionary? A reformer works within constraints, nudging them. A revolutionary stretches constraints until they snap. Caesar began as reformer, debt relief adjustments, provincial oversight, expansion of citizenship pathways, administrative restructuring. But at each resistance point, he escalated rather than retreated. And escalation, repeated enough, becomes revolution. Yet here is the twist. Caesar never framed himself as revolutionary. He framed himself as stabilizer. This is key. He justified actions as necessary responses to chaos. When crossing the Rubicon, he claimed he was defending his dignitas, his honor and legal rights against corrupt senators. When accepting dictatorship, it was to restore order. When reforming institutions, it was to improve efficiency. In his own narrative, he was protector of Rome. That is how transformative figures often see themselves. Intent and impact diverge. He did not wake up thinking, "Today I end a 5-century-old system." He woke up thinking, "Today I refuse to be diminished." History is often shaped more by personal psychology than grand ideology. Now consider the assassination again, not as event, but as symbol. Brutus and Cassius believed killing the man would restore equilibrium. But they misunderstood something profound. Systems adapt faster than conspirators anticipate. By the time Caesar fell, too many careers, loyalties, and expectations were already reorganized around concentrated authority. Veterans expected land from powerful patrons. Citizens expected grain and games funded by dominant leaders. Provincial administrators expected direct accountability upward rather than sideways through Senate committees. The Republic's habits had shifted. Removing Caesar did not reverse the habits. It only removed the stabilizing force at the center temporarily. Octavian stepped in because the system now required someone like him. Caesar made single rule imaginable. Augustus made it permanent, but let's leave Rome for a moment. Look at world history. How many leaders since have been compared to Caesar? Napoleon, various revolutionary generals, modern presidents accused of executive overreach, military strongmen claiming to defend democracy while consolidating authority. Whenever someone challenges institutional limits under the banner of necessity, Caesar's name appears in commentary. Why? Because he embodies the eternal tension between order and liberty, between efficiency and restraint, between charismatic leadership and institutional continuity. He forces the question: is stability worth centralization? And there is no easy answer. Rome, after decades of civil war, accepted centralized authority because it delivered peace. The Pax Romana under Augustus and his successors brought relative stability for generations. From a citizen's perspective, peace can feel more valuable than procedural purity. From a senator's perspective, lost influence feels like catastrophe. Caesar stood at that crossroads. He prioritized effectiveness over tradition, and tradition did not forgive him. There is also something deeply human about his arc. He began insecure. He ended iconic. He feared obscurity. He achieved immortality. But immortality required martyrdom. If he had lived to old age, perhaps scandals, failures, or stagnation would have diluted his legend. Instead, he froze at peak intensity, stabbed at 55, still ascending, still controversial, still dangerous. Death crystallized him. It turned politician into symbol. It simplified complexities into archetype. Hero to some, tyrant to others, catalyst to all. So what remains? Not just empire, not just calendar reform, not just military conquest. What remains is a psychological template. When ambition collides with unstable systems, escalation becomes tempting. When institutions obstruct charismatic individuals, conflict becomes inevitable. When leaders begin to believe they are synonymous with stability, they risk blurring the line between service and supremacy. Caesar walked that line. He did not fall off it accidentally. He chose to step further each time, and perhaps that is the final lesson. Greatness rarely happens by accident, neither does systemic rupture. Both require repeated decisions in the same direction. Caesar's life was a series of decisions that all pointed toward expansion of personal agency, refuse Sulla, outspend rivals, forge alliances, conquer Gaul, cross the Rubicon, accept perpetual dictatorship, each move logical in isolation, revolutionary in accumulation. If you stand at the Rubicon today, metaphorically, you face the same internal dialogue: stay within boundaries and preserve structure, or cross and redefine structure entirely. The river itself is never wide. The consequences are: Caesar crossed, Rome transformed, the world inherited empire. And for over 2,000 years, whenever power centralizes around one extraordinary figure, whenever a leader insists that only they can restore order, whenever institutions bend under charisma, the ghost of Julius Caesar stands quietly in the background, not judging, just reminding: this has happened before, and it will happen again. He began as a boy in a noisy district, burdened by ancestral glory. He became a general writing his own legend. He died beneath marble and betrayal. He lives on as archetype. That is the full arc, from fading nobility to permanent name, from republic to empire, from man to myth. And myths, unlike men, are very hard to assassinate, but they do evolve. And over time, Caesar's image stopped belonging solely to Rome. It became transferable, adopted, reshaped, weaponized by rulers who needed historical gravity attached to their own ambition. This is where his afterlife becomes even more fascinating than his life, because once a man becomes archetype, he no longer controls how he is used. The Roman Empire itself institutionalized his name. Caesar shifted from surname to title. Under Augustus, it designated heir. Later, it became synonymous with emperor. Eventually, in the Byzantine East, it transformed into Caesar. In Slavic lands, it became Tsar. His identity linguistically embedded itself in rulership across continents. That is not normal legacy, that is semantic conquest. Imagine this psychologically: a single individual's name becoming shorthand for supreme authority in multiple civilizations. That is how deeply he altered the imagination of power. But why him specifically? Why not Pompey? Why not Augustus? Because Caesar represents rupture. Augustus represents consolidation. Rupture is more dramatic. Humans remember earthquakes more vividly than stable architecture. Caesar's life reads like acceleration. Augustus's reads like management. One ignites, the other sustains. Ignition is more mythic. During the Renaissance, thinkers revisited Roman texts with renewed intensity. Caesar's commentaries were studied not just for history but for leadership insight. His clarity of prose, strategic framing, and calm depiction of violence fascinated scholars and generals alike. Napoleon Bonaparte read him obsessively, and you can see the parallels: military genius, political ambition, manipulation of republican structures, self-coronation in symbolic form, exile, return. Both men believed themselves agents of historical necessity. Both reshaped republics into centralized regimes. Both inspired devotion and resistance, and both became cautionary examples for later generations. This repetition is not coincidence, it is pattern recognition. Whenever a society experiences gridlock, inequality, or political fragmentation, the appeal of a decisive figure rises. Caesar becomes metaphor, sometimes positive, sometimes ominous, but here's something subtler. Caesar's story also reshaped how Western culture understands ambition. Before him, Roman virtue emphasized restraint, collective governance, ancestral tradition. after him, ambition gained romantic dimension. The idea of the singular, world-altering individual entered political mythology permanently. He became proof that one person could redirect civilization's trajectory. That idea fuels entrepreneurs, revolutionaries, dictators, visionaries. It is dangerous and inspiring simultaneously. Let's return briefly to his psychology one final time, not as historian, but as observer of human behavior. Caesar's defining trait was not cruelty, nor was it brilliance alone, it was momentum. He rarely allowed himself to stall. Even in crisis he acted. Even when uncertain he projected certainty. Even when cornered he escalated. Momentum creates perception of inevitability, and inevitability attracts followers. People align with leaders who seem to be moving history forward rather than reacting to it. Caesar understood this instinctively, but momentum has a shadow. When everything accelerates around one person, institutions weaken. Succession becomes fragile. Stability depends on personality rather than process. That fragility cost him his life. It nearly cost Rome everything. Augustus learned to slow the visible momentum while maintaining control underneath. He institutionalized what Caesar personalized. That is the difference between catalytic force and sustainable rule. And yet, here's the paradox that makes Caesar unforgettable. He failed in the short term. He was assassinated by his peers. He did not secure peaceful succession. He did not finish many reforms fully, but he succeeded in the long term. He permanently altered governance models. He expanded Roman territory irreversibly. He embedded his name into political language for millennia. He shaped Europe's future more profoundly than many longer-lived emperors. This duality, failure in life, triumph in legacy, intensifies myth. We are drawn to figures who burn bright and fall dramatically. Stability is admirable, but intensity is memorable. Now imagine a counterfactual. If Caesar had chosen compromise, if he had stepped down after Gaul, if he had negotiated quietly with the Senate, if he had refused perpetual dictatorship, perhaps the Republic would have limped along a few more decades. Perhaps another ambitious general would eventually have forced similar transformation. But Caesar's particular blend of charisma, timing, and audacity accelerated inevitability. He did not create ambition in Rome, he outperformed it. And by outperforming everyone else, he made the old balance impossible to restore. So what is his final psychological profile? A man driven by comparison, a strategist who understood narrative, a leader who built loyalty through proximity. A politician who escalated under threat, a reformer who underestimated elite fear. A visionary who blurred into autocrat, a mortal who achieved symbolic immortality. Complex, contradictory, human. When we speak his name now, we rarely think about the dusty streets of the Subura. We don't picture the young exile hiding from Sulla's agents. We don't see the captured aristocrat joking with pirates to preserve dignity. We see marble busts, laurel wreaths, crossed rivers. Daggers raised in Senate chambers, but those moments were not isolated. They were the visible peaks of an internal mountain built slowly from insecurity, hunger, and relentless forward motion. And that may be the most powerful insight of all. History-changing figures are not born believing they will change history. They are born feeling that remaining small is unacceptable. Everything else follows. Rome feared kings. Caesar refused to be small. The Republic resisted adaptation. He forced it. The Senate tried to preserve tradition. He accelerated transformation. His enemies tried to erase him. They immortalized him instead. That is the arc, from boyhood expectation to calculated ambition to civil war to dictatorship to assassination to empire to archetype. And if you listen closely, beneath centuries of retelling, beneath political analysis and dramatic portrayals, you can still hear the quiet engine that drove him. Not cruelty, not ideology, but an intolerance for insignificance. That engine built legends. That engine crossed rivers. That engine reshaped governance. That engine invited daggers. And that engine still fascinates us, because somewhere in every ambitious society, there is always someone standing at their own Rubicon, convinced they are necessary. Sometimes they are, sometimes they are not, but the story of Julius Caesar ensures we will always recognize the moment when someone steps forward and says, in action if not in words. The die is cast and history begins to move faster, but eventually it slows enough for reflection, and when it does, it asks a dangerous question. Was Caesar inevitable, or was he a warning? By the time Rome stabilized under Augustus, a new generation had grown up knowing only one reality: centralized authority wrapped in republican language. For them, the chaos of late Republican infighting was memory, not lived trauma. Stability felt natural, prosperity felt earned, expansion felt justified, and Caesar's name, once polarizing, became foundational. Temples were dedicated to Divus Julius, the deified Julius. A comet appearing shortly after his death was interpreted as his soul ascending. Religion absorbed politics, myth absorbed mortality. When a society deifies a leader, it does something profound. It transforms political risk into sacred narrative. Caesar was no longer just a man who had seized power. He became chosen, and once history is sanctified, critique weakens. But beneath divine titles and marble statues lies a more uncomfortable truth. Caesar exposed a recurring flaw in republics. They depend on collective restraint. Restraint is invisible when it works. It feels slow, frustrating, procedural. When someone refuses restraint and succeeds, the entire structure must either adapt or fracture. Caesar tested the republic's capacity to restrain ambition. It failed, not because laws were absent, but because enforcement required unity among elites who were themselves divided by ego, fear, and competition. He exploited division. He unified loyalty around himself. That pattern echoes through history repeatedly. There is something else rarely discussed. Caesar was not universally loved. In fact, many ordinary Romans were ambivalent. Yes, he distributed grain. Yes, he provided spectacle. Yes, he settled veterans, but Rome was complex. Rural Italians, provincial elites, urban aristocrats, their interests varied. Support for Caesar was not blind devotion, it was calculation. People align with strength when strength appears durable. The moment durability cracks, loyalty shifts. The conspirators believed durability had cracked. They miscalculated the emotional aftermath. Emotion outruns logic in moments of violence, and Antony's funeral speech harnessed that emotion masterfully. Again, narrative decided momentum. Now step outside Rome entirely. Consider the broader Western political imagination. The American founders studied Roman history intensely. They feared Caesar-like figures. They debated executive power explicitly in response to Roman precedent. The term dictator carried the Roman shadow. Warnings against concentrated authority often invoked Caesar as example. 2,000 years later, his life still functions as political case study. That is not normal historical memory. That is structural imprinting. He is less a biography and more a recurring chapter in governance debates. But strip away institutions for one final human moment. Picture him in the final year, 55 years old, victorious, reforming, elevated, surrounded by statues and honors. Did he feel secure, or did he feel pressure increasing? Power isolates. The higher you rise, the fewer equals remain. Conversations shift from debate to deference. Warnings soften, flattery intensifies, reality becomes filtered. Even the strongest minds are susceptible. Caesar may have sensed tension. He certainly knew resentment existed, but perhaps he believed his momentum was irreversible, that his clemency had neutralized hostility. That Rome, exhausted by war, would not dare plunge back into chaos. That assumption cost him, not because he was foolish, but because he underestimated how existential fear can override rational self-preservation in others. When elites believe they are witnessing permanent displacement, they act desperately. Desperation wields knives. And yet, if he could see the centuries that followed, what would he think? An empire stretching from Britain to the Middle East. Roads, aqueducts, cities. Latin shaping languages, his calendar structuring time, his name defining rulers. Would he consider the cost justified, or would he see unintended consequences spiraling beyond intention? We cannot know, but we can observe this. He valued magnitude over moderation, and magnitude leaves long shadows. There is a final psychological paradox worth acknowledging. Caesar sought control, yet the meaning of his life escaped his control almost immediately after death. Brutus claimed to defend liberty in killing him. Antony claimed to defend loyalty in avenging him. Augustus claimed to defend stability in inheriting him. Later emperors claimed legitimacy through him. Medieval rulers claimed continuity from him. Modern thinkers claim warnings from him. Each era reshaped him to serve its own narrative. Once mythic identity becomes communal property, he no longer belongs to himself. He belongs to interpretation. So where does that leave us with the man who refused obscurity, refused limitation, refused retreat, and in doing so forced a civilization to transform around him? He was not purely hero, not purely villain, not purely reformer, not purely tyrant. He was catalytic force embodied in human form, and catalysts rarely survive their own reactions. Stand again at the metaphorical Rubicon. Feel the weight of decision. On one side, continuity. On the other, irreversible change. Caesar teaches us something sobering. Crossing is easy, living with the consequences is not. He crossed. Rome convulsed. The Republic ended, the Empire rose, and the name Caesar became eternal. History moves in waves. Institutions rise, strain, fracture, and reorganize. Ambitious individuals emerge in moments of instability. Some stabilize, some destabilize further. Some, like Caesar, do both simultaneously. He was symptom and cause, product and producer, victim and architect. And that complexity is precisely why we still speak of him, not because he was perfect, but because he was pivotal. In the end, perhaps the most accurate way to understand Julius Caesar is this. He did not simply change Rome. He revealed what Rome had already become, and once revealed, there was no going back. The die was cast long before he spoke the words, but some throws echo longer than the hand that cast them. And here, at the far edge of his story, we arrive at something quieter than conquest, quieter than assassination, quieter even than empire. We arrive at legacy measured not in territory, but in human pattern. For centuries after his death, ambitious leaders studied him the way generals study terrain. not to admire him, to understand him. Because Caesar represents a recurring moment in every political system, the moment when structure begins to lag behind reality. The Roman Republic was designed for a city-state managing nearby rivals. By Caesar's lifetime, Rome controlled vast provinces across continents. Wealth from conquest distorted economics. Military commands lasted years, not months. Soldiers identified more with generals than with Senate decrees. The machinery had not evolved fast enough. And when machinery fails to adapt, someone eventually forces adaptation. Caesar was that force, but force always raises the same moral tension. If a system is broken, is it betrayal to override it, or responsibility? He believed or convinced himself that he was preserving Rome by centralizing it. His assassins believed they were preserving Rome by killing him. Both claimed guardianship. Both feared collapse. Only one vision endured. There is something psychologically important here. Most historical conflicts are not fought between good and evil. They are fought between competing definitions of stability. Caesar defined stability as strong, centralized leadership. Brutus defined stability as restoration of constitutional balance. Antony defined stability as loyalty to fallen authority. Octavian defined stability as permanent executive dominance disguised as tradition. 4 men, 4 interpretations, one collapsing system, and the one who understood narrative best won posthumously. Let's examine the emotional engine beneath Caesar's ambition one last time. He was obsessed with comparison. Alexander haunted him. Pompey rivaled him. The Senate constrained him. He did not measure himself against comfort. He measured himself against immortality. That is not common psychology. Most people seek security. He sought magnitude, and magnitude rarely coexists peacefully with shared governance. Shared governance requires compromise. Compromise requires ego management. Ego management requires internal limits. Caesar's limits were external, and when external limits blocked him, he removed them. That is the pattern, and yet it would be shallow to reduce him to ego alone. He was administratively capable. He reformed taxation systems. He standardized provincial governance. He extended citizenship. He improved infrastructure planning. These are not the actions of a man interested only in glory. He wanted Rome to function better, but he wanted it to function under him. That distinction defined everything. Now imagine being one of the senators in 44 BCE. You have watched this man accumulate power steadily for a decade. You have seen him forgive enemies, which means he chooses who survives. You have seen his face on coins. You have heard crowds cheer his name louder than the Republic itself. You know history remembers founders, not committees. You begin to realize that your lineage, your influence, your identity as guardian of Roman tradition is dissolving. Fear grows quietly, not fear of violence, fear of irrelevance. Irrelevance terrifies elites more than death, and so they acted, but they acted too late. Because Caesar had already shifted the center of gravity, here is the lasting transformation. Before Caesar, Rome's ultimate authority was collective memory, mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors. After Caesar, Rome's ultimate authority was concentrated presence. That shift never reversed. Even emperors who ruled modestly still ruled alone. The Senate became advisory, the assemblies ceremonial. The Republic's skeleton remained, but its muscle moved elsewhere. And once muscle relocates, bones cannot command. Centuries later, when Rome itself fell in the West, the idea of Caesar did not fall with it. Medieval kings invoked Roman imperial continuity. The Holy Roman emperors claimed descent from Caesar's authority. Russian rulers adopted the title Tsar to imply succession from Roman Caesars. Even in collapse, his archetype endured. That is durability beyond geography. But let's narrow the lens again. Strip away empire, strip away myth. What remains at the center? A man unwilling to accept smallness. That trait alone does not guarantee greatness. Many refuse smallness. Few possess the discipline, intelligence, timing, and audacity to turn refusal into historical pivot. Caesar did. And he paid for it with his life. There is a quiet irony in how his story concludes. The conspirators hoped to prevent monarchy. Instead, they accelerated it. They hoped to restore balance. Instead, they deepened instability. They believed removing the individual would restore the institution. But institutions, once hollowed, cannot be revived by subtraction. They require reconstruction. Augustus understood this. He did not simply inherit Caesar's power. He redesigned its presentation. He slowed the visible pace. He restored rituals while keeping authority centralized. He learned from the mistakes without abandoning the transformation. In that sense, Caesar was the spark. Augustus was the architect. And what of us? Why does his story still feel relevant? Because every era faces its own version of concentrated ambition. Whenever political gridlock grows frustrating. Whenever institutions appear outdated. Whenever charismatic individuals promise efficiency over procedure. The Caesar question returns. Is this reform or rupture? Is this preservation or consolidation? History does not provide simple answers. It provides patterns. And Caesar is one of the clearest patterns ever recorded. If you stand at the very beginning of his life in the Subura, nothing guarantees empire. If you stand at the moment he refuses Sulla, nothing guarantees survival. If you stand at the Rubicon, nothing guarantees victory. If you stand in the Senate on the Ides, nothing guarantees immortality. And yet the arc connects, because he never stopped moving forward. Never accepted reduction, never allowed setback to define finality. That consistency of direction is what makes his story cohesive. He was always advancing, even when retreat might have preserved him. Perhaps that is the final tension. Is it better to live long within limits, or briefly without them? Caesar chose the latter. Rome adapted. The world changed. And 2,000 years later, we still return to him, not because he ruled the longest, not because he conquered the most territory, not because he died the most tragically, but because he represents the moment when personal ambition fuses with historical opportunity and neither backs down. That fusion reshapes civilizations, sometimes for stability, sometimes for upheaval, often for both. The boy who felt overshadowed became the standard against which rulers are measured. The general who wrote his own victories became the template for political storytelling. The dictator who frightened a republic became the foundation of an empire. And the man who fell beneath 23 wounds rose into linguistic eternity. Caesar. Not just a name, a threshold. Cross it and systems change, refuse to cross and they decay differently. But either way, history remembers the moment. The die was cast, the river was crossed, the republic was transformed, the empire was born, and T-myth never stopped marching. But myths, when examined closely, reveal something even more unsettling than glory. They reveal how easily humans trade complexity for clarity. Julius Caesar in life was layered, contradictory, evolving. In memory, he became simplified, either the tyrant who murdered liberty or the visionary who rescued Rome from paralysis. But history, when stripped of slogans, tells a more disturbing story. He was neither savior nor destroyer alone. He was accelerator, and acceleration is neutral until directed. Let's return to the Republic one final time, not as a stage for Caesar, but as a living organism. For nearly 5 centuries, Rome operated under a system built on suspicion of concentrated power. 2 consuls served simultaneously. Terms were limited, offices were staggered, even dictators were temporary. The system assumed something crucial: that no individual would accumulate enough momentum to override it. That assumption failed, but not instantly. First came extended military commands, then extraordinary exceptions, then normalization of those exceptions. Caesar did not invent emergency powers, he inherited them. He simply refused to relinquish them permanently, and once that door was opened, it never fully closed again. Here is the uncomfortable insight. Institutions are strongest when ambitious individuals voluntarily respect limits. They weaken when ambition outpaces tradition. Caesar respected limits until they threatened his trajectory. Then he removed them. From his perspective, that was self-preservation. From the Senate's perspective, it was domination. From history's perspective, it was transformation. Consider the Rubicon again, not as river, but as psychological metaphor. Every ambitious person encounters one. A moment when playing by the rules ensures mediocrity. A moment when breaking the rules promises magnitude. The decision is rarely framed as destroy the system. It is framed as defend my position. Caesar did not cross saying, I will end the Republic. He crossed saying, I will not be politically erased. Intent matters morally, outcome matters historically. The two are not always aligned. Now fast forward centuries. The Roman Empire eventually fractures. Internal corruption, external pressures, economic strain. Yet even as the Western Empire collapses in 476 CE, the Eastern Roman Empire Byzantium continues for nearly 1,000 more years. And throughout it all, rulers still bear the imprint of centralized authority established after Caesar. One man's escalation reshaped governance across a millennium. That is scale beyond imagination. But here's something even more interesting. Despite his dominance, Caesar never built a stable succession model. That omission is revealing. He was brilliant at acquisition, less concerned with continuity. He adopted Octavian late strategically, yes, but without a clearly institutionalized transition framework. That gap nearly plunged Rome back into chaos. Augustus solved it by embedding succession into imperial structure more carefully. Caesar thought in conquest, Augustus thought in durability. One changes direction, the other secures it. What makes Caesar eternally compelling is not just what he achieved, it's that he forces us to confront a paradox. Progress often requires disruption, but disruption often destroys the very thing it claims to improve. He modernized governance, he destabilized governance, he expanded Rome, he fractured Rome, he preserved order through dominance, he provoked violence through dominance, all true simultaneously. There's a reason Shakespeare's portrayal remains powerful. Et tu, Brute, is not merely accusation, it is disbelief, not that he was attacked, but that someone he spared participated. Mercy for Caesar was both strategy and identity. He believed clemency would secure loyalty. He underestimated how humiliation lingers beneath gratitude. When you spare someone publicly, you remind them of your superiority. Some accept that, others cannot, and resentment grows quietly. Elite resentment is patient. It smiles in daylight. It sharpens steel at night. Zoom out one last time. If Caesar had never existed, Rome might still have become imperial eventually. Structural forces were already moving, but he accelerated the timeline. He forced clarity through conflict. He compressed decades of tension into years of crisis. Acceleration is his signature, and acceleration defines how we remember him. Not the paperwork, not the committee meetings, not the procedural reforms. We remember bridges thrown across the Rhine in 10 days. We remember legions marching through Gaul. We remember the frozen moment before crossing the Rubicon. We remember daggers flashing in the Senate. High-intensity moments. Caesar's life reads like a sequence of irreversible decisions. Because that is exactly what it was. In the end, perhaps his greatest impact was psychological. He shattered the illusion that Rome's system was untouchable. Once shattered, the aura of permanence vanished. Citizens realized, consciously or not, that governance structures are human creations. And what humans create, humans can alter. That realization is empowering and destabilizing. Pause threes. He wanted immortality. He achieved it, but immortality does not belong to flesh. It belongs to narrative. Every time a leader centralizes authority in the name of efficiency. Every time a republic strains under internal division. Every time ambition collides with institutional restraint. Caesar's shadow lengthens, not as prophecy, as precedent. Let's end where we began. A child born into fading nobility, a teenager defying a dictator, a young man captured by pirates who refused humiliation, a politician who outspent rivals, a general who wrote his own legend, a consul who bypassed obstruction, a commander who crossed a forbidden river, a dictator who accepted permanence. A man who fell beneath 23 blades, a name that became title, a life that became threshold. He did not set out to become myth. He set out to avoid insignificance, and in avoiding insignificance, he altered civilization. That is the enduring lesson. History does not always turn on virtue. It often turns on velocity. Caesar was velocity embodied, and once unleashed, velocity rarely returns quietly to stillness. The republic ended, the empire rose, the name endured. And somewhere between ambition and inevitability, Julius Caesar became more than a man. He became a measure of power, of risk, of consequence, and of how far one person can push a system before it transforms forever. He became a measure of how much a system can bend, of how far a single will can stretch tradition, of what happens when personal momentum outruns institutional design. But there is one final layer to this story, one that doesn't live in marble statues or imperial titles. It lives in the quiet space between ambition and self-awareness. If you strip away the victories, the reforms, the wars, the blood, what remains is a man who believed he was necessary, not useful, necessary. That distinction is everything. When someone believes they are useful, they collaborate. When someone believes they are necessary, they override. Caesar crossed from useful to necessary somewhere between Gaul and the Rubicon. In Gaul, he was Rome's champion. After Gaul, he became Rome's central pillar in his own mind. And once you believe the system cannot function without you, compromise feels like sabotage. This is not unique to Caesar. It is a recurring human temptation. Founders of companies feel it. Revolutionary leaders feel it. Generals feel it. Presidents feel it. The moment success reinforces identity, identity fuses with structure. I built this. I stabilized this. I saved this. Without me, it collapses. That belief is intoxicating, and sometimes it is partially true. But the belief itself becomes dangerous when unchecked, because it removes the final restraint, humility. Did Caesar lack humility? Not entirely. He could be charming, self-deprecating at times, generous, capable of calculated modesty in public, but humility is not performance. It is internal limit, and internal limits are what prevent external overreach. Caesar's limits were tactical, not philosophical. He would delay if necessary, he would negotiate if beneficial, but he would not accept reduction. There is one haunting detail in the final months of his life. He reportedly planned campaigns eastward against Parthia, a grand expedition, another conquest, another chapter. Even after absolute dominance in Rome, he was not done. Momentum never satisfied him. This tells us something profound. Achievement did not quiet him, it amplified him. For some personalities, success creates rest. For others, it creates escalation. Caesar belonged to the second category, and this is why his story resonates across centuries. Because societies periodically produce individuals who move faster than the frameworks containing them. Sometimes those individuals are essential during crisis. Sometimes they become crisis. Often they are both. Caesar stabilized Rome by ending civil wars. He destabilized Rome by centralizing authority. He preserved territory. He undermined tradition. He enforced order. He provoked assassination. Duality defines him. When the daggers struck on the Ides of March, something else died with him. The illusion that Rome could return to what it had been. Even if the conspirators had succeeded perfectly, even if order had resumed immediately, the precedent was set. Legions had marched on Rome. A general had ruled for life. A political system had been overridden by individual force. That memory cannot be erased. Once possibility is proven, it remains available. That is his deepest legacy. He expanded the realm of the possible. And perhaps that is why we still study him. Not because he conquered Gaul, not because he reformed the calendar, not because he was assassinated dramatically, but because he represents a threshold in human governance. The moment when charisma, military loyalty, public support, and political fragmentation align behind one person. When that alignment happens, systems shift. The question is never whether they shift. The question is in which direction. If you were to reduce his life to a single psychological sentence, it might be this. He would rather risk collapse than accept diminishment. That mindset built empires. It also ended republics. Now imagine a quiet evening in Rome, long after the Senate floor has been cleaned of blood. Citizens pass the theater of Pompey. The city hums. Life continues, but something intangible has changed. Power no longer feels evenly distributed. It feels concentrated. Expectations adjust. People grow accustomed to strong singular leadership, and once accustomed, reversal becomes unlikely. Cultural psychology shifts faster than laws. Caesar shifted cultural psychology. And here is the final irony. He never wore a crown. He never declared himself king. He rejected the diadem publicly. He preserved republican language. And yet he altered Rome more profoundly than any crowned monarch could have, because he did not attack the system head-on. He innated it, expanded within it, stretched it, until it transformed under strain. That is more powerful than conquest from outside. It is transformation from within. The boy from the suburra wanted greatness. The young politician wanted influence. The general wanted glory. The consul wanted authority. The dictator wanted permanence. Each stage felt like progression. None felt like betrayal to him. But in accumulation, progression became revolution. When you study Caesar long enough, you realize something unsettling. History is not always shaped by villains. It is often shaped by competent, driven individuals who refuse to slow down. Their confidence convinces others. Their success silences critics. Their momentum creates inevitability. Until it doesn't, until resistance crystallizes. And yet, even steel could not silence him. Because physical death does not end structural change, it sometimes accelerates it. The conspirators ended a man. They did not end the shift. Augustus inherited it. The empire institutionalized it. And the name Caesar became synonymous with rule itself. So when we finish this story, we do not end with the Senate floor. We end with a question that echoes forward. What happens when ambition outgrows restraint? Sometimes you get reform. Sometimes you get collapse. Sometimes, as Rome did, you get transformation so complete that future generations forget there was ever another Wa. Julius Caesar was not destiny. He was decision layered upon decision. A sequence of choices consistently aimed toward expansion, each one defensible in isolation, and that is the final lesson. History turns not on single dramatic acts alone, but on patterns of escalation. Caesar's life was escalation made flesh. From obscurity to dominance, from dominance to permanence, from permanence to myth, he refused to remain small, and the world has been living inside the consequences ever since. Theti was cast, the river was crossed, the republic was transformed, the empire endured, the name survived. The pattern remains, but patterns only become fully visible when we slow down enough to examine the texture inside them. When we stop looking at Caesar as a symbol stamped onto coins or carved into marble and instead trace the grain of his decisions. The pauses before them, the pressures around them, the private calculations that accumulated quietly until they erupted into public consequence. If we return carefully this time to the final year of his life, we find not a man drunk on chaos, but a man who believed he had finally imposed coherence upon a world that had nearly torn itself apart. A man who had defeated rival generals, pardoned former enemies, reorganized administrative systems, stabilized grain supply, recalibrated the calendar, expanded the Senate, planned Eastern campaigns, and positioned Rome not as a fractured republic limping from crisis to crisis, but as a unified power radiating outward under a single center of gravity himself. And here is where the psychology becomes more intricate. It is easy to imagine Caesar as reckless at the end, as though accepting the title of dictator perpetuo were an impulsive act born of ego alone. Yet when you consider the sequence of civil wars that preceded it, Marius and Sulla, Pompey and himself, the spiraling instability that made temporary dictatorship seem insufficient, you begin to understand how permanence could be framed not as tyranny, but as insulation against relapse. As a structural brace inserted into a building that had already cracked multiple times, he may have believed genuinely that Rome required continuity of authority long enough to recalibrate itself. The Senate, however, saw something different. They saw not a brace, but a ceiling lowering. They saw a future in which their relevance would continue shrinking, where legislation would be proposed from above and merely ratified below, where ancestral prestige would be overshadowed by proximity to a single individual whose victories dwarfed theirs and whose popularity made opposition appear petty. And the more Caesar was honored, the more intolerable their position felt. Imagine sitting in that chamber as statues of him multiplied as he entered in triumphal dress, as senators rose reflexively, as public cheers outside grew louder than deliberations within. Imagine the subtle humiliation of realizing that Rome's loyalty was migrating from institution to individual, that the Republic's symbolic center had shifted without formal declaration. Humiliation does not always erupt immediately, it calcifies. Caesar's clemency, which he believed a masterstroke of magnanimity and political strategy, carried within it a silent toxin, because when you spare a rival publicly, you assert moral superiority in a way that can either bind them in gratitude or harden them in resentment. And among Rome's elite, men raised on honor, lineage, and pride, the latter reaction simmered beneath outward compliance. Brutus is often remembered as the tragic betrayer, but psychologically he represents something more complicated. A man torn between personal indebtedness to Caesar and inherited identity as guardian of a republic that defined itself against kings. A man whose ancestors had expelled Tarquin centuries earlier. A man whose very name was wrapped in anti-monarchical myth. When Caesar accumulated titles that echoed permanence, Brutus did not merely see political change, he saw ancestral expectation colliding with present loyalty. And when identity fractures internally, action becomes almost inevitable. On the morning of the Ides, Caesar reportedly hesitated, influenced by Calpurnia's anxiety, by omens, by rumors of unease, and for a brief window history balanced on hesitation, because had he chosen to remain home, had he signaled caution rather than inevitability, perhaps the conspirators would have delayed, perhaps the plot would have unraveled, perhaps paranoia would have consumed them before steel was drawn. But hesitation was not aligned with the persona he had cultivated. He had spent decades projecting forward motion, dismissing threats, laughing at danger from pirates to political rivals, and to stay home would have contradicted the identity he had built so meticulously. So he went. And the rest unfolded with brutal speed, not as theatrical dialogue, but as compressed violence, confusion, fabric tearing, metal striking flesh, blood pooling beneath Pompey's statue, that symbolic convergence of past rivalries and present collapse. The conspirators believed they were performing surgery, excising a tumor to restore health, but they misunderstood the depth of systemic change already embedded within Rome's body. Legions were loyal to commanders, citizens accustomed to centralized grain distribution, provinces administered under direct authority. The Republic had already evolved beyond its original blueprint. When Antony seized the narrative at the funeral, reading Caesar's will, revealing gifts to citizens, displaying wounds, he did more than incite anger. He reframed the assassination as betrayal not of a tyrant, but of a benefactor, transforming elite fear into popular fury. And once public emotion aligned against the conspirators, their vision of restoration collapsed under the weight of unintended consequence. The civil war returned not because Caesar had lived, but because Caesar had changed the expectations of power. Octavian's rise then becomes less surprising and more structural. He did not invent the path to singular authority. He inherited the template, refined it, slowed its visible pace, cloaked it in reverence for tradition, and institutionalized what Caesar had personalized, demonstrating that the Republic's transformation was not reversible through subtraction, only manageable through adaptation. And thus the empire emerged not as abrupt replacement, but as culmination. What makes Caesar enduringly compelling is not merely that he altered governance, but that he embodied a recurring human phenomenon. The individual whose internal refusal to accept limitation aligns with a historical moment ripe for acceleration, creating a fusion between personality and circumstance that propels events beyond incremental reform into structural metamorphosis. He did not wake intending to destroy the Republic. He woke intending to preserve his dignity, expand his influence, protect his position, stabilize Rome, surpass rivals, each motive defensible, each decision rational within its immediate context, yet collectively they formed a trajectory that no longer fit within the Republic's inherited constraints. This is how systems change, not through single explosions, but through sustained directional pressure. If we examine his life from beginning to end, the thread remains consistent. The young aristocrat in the Subura, aware of faded prestige and divine lineage, refusing mediocrity. The teenager defying Sulla's command to divorce. The captive mocking pirates. The aedile bankrupting himself for spectacle. The politician forging alliances across rival egos. The general writing his own narrative in Gaul. The commander stepping across the Rubicon. The dictator accepting permanence. The man who would rather risk annihilation than submit to diminishment. At no stage did he choose reduction, and that consistency is both the source of his greatness and the catalyst of his fall. In the centuries that followed, rulers borrowed his name, revolutionaries invoked his defiance, republics cited him as cautionary tale, playwrights immortalized his betrayal, political theorists dissected his escalation, and languages across continents absorbed his identity into titles of sovereignty, proving that while flesh decays, narrative persists when it captures a fundamental tension inside human organization, the tension between collective restraint and singular ambition. Caesar did not resolve that tension, he intensified it, and by intensifying it, he ensured that every future generation confronting concentrated power would see his shadow in the background, asking whether crossing the river is preservation or peril. If there is a final image worth holding, it is not the assassination, not the triumph, not the laurel crown, but the quieter psychological moment of realization, perhaps late at night, perhaps after another reform passed, perhaps while planning the Parthian campaign, when he must have sensed that Rome was no longer merely a republic he served, but a structure reorganizing itself around him, that history had begun bending in response to his velocity. And that retreat was no longer compatible with identity. That realization is intoxicating, it is also isolating, and isolation at the top narrows perception, so we end not with a verdict but with a recognition. Julius Caesar was not simply conqueror, dictator, martyr, or founder. He was a catalyst whose internal momentum met a structurally strained republic at precisely the wrong or right moment, producing a transformation that outlived him by millennia, embedding his name into political vocabulary and his pattern into the psychology of power. He refused to remain small. He refused to slow down. He refused to relinquish forward motion. And Rome, unable to contain that refusal within its inherited framework, transformed. The die was cast long before the river was crossed. The river was crossed long before the knives were drawn. The knives were drawn long before the empire stabilized, and the empire stabilized long before the myth settled. What began as personal ambition became civilizational pivot, and that is why even now his story does not feel distant. It feels perennial because Caesar's story does not truly belong to the past. It belongs to the recurring architecture of human power, to those moments when institutions grow rigid, when ambition grows restless, and when a single individual senses, correctly or not, that history has created an opening wide enough for irreversible action. If we stand at the very end of this arc, beyond the assassins, beyond Augustus, beyond the marble calm of the Pax Romana, and ask what remains once the noise settles, the answer is not simply empire, nor calendar reform, nor linguistic legacy. It is the normalization of concentrated authority as a solution to disorder. Before Caesar, Rome feared kings as existential threats to liberty. After Caesar, Rome accepted one-man rule as pragmatic necessity, provided it was dressed in the language of tradition, cloaked in the rituals of continuity, and framed as service rather than domination. That psychological adjustment is subtle but monumental. Once a society internalizes the idea that stability may require singular control, the threshold for future centralization lowers permanently. Caesar did not invent that idea, but he made it workable. Yet to reduce him to architect of autocracy would be to flatten the complexity of his character, because he was also a product of the very dysfunction he exploited. The Senate had grown obstructionist, factional rivalry paralyzed legislation, provincial corruption eroded trust, and military commanders accumulated loyalty precisely because the Republic relied on them to expand and defend its territories, meaning that Caesar's rise was not an alien invasion into a healthy organism, but an escalation from within a system already bending under its own contradictions. He did not overthrow a stable equilibrium. He exposed its fragility. And once fragility is exposed, legitimacy weakens. There is something almost tragic in the way his virtues and flaws were entangled so tightly that separating them becomes impossible. His decisiveness ended wars, but it also erased boundaries. His generosity bound soldiers and citizens to him, but it humiliated elites. His administrative clarity improved governance, but it centralized it. His courage inspired loyalty, but it dismissed caution. His refusal to submit preserved his agency, but it dissolved the republic. In other words, the traits that built his ascent were the same traits that guaranteed resistance. Success amplified the very characteristics that would provoke retaliation. When we imagine the final minutes in the theater of Pompey, it is tempting to linger on betrayal, on Brutus's presence among the attackers, on the symbolism of falling beneath a rival's statue. But perhaps the more revealing detail is how quickly history moved afterward, how the conspirators' certainty evaporated into panic, how the public did not erupt in gratitude for restored liberty but recoiled into uncertainty, how Antony's speech redirected emotional current, and how Octavian's inheritance demonstrated that removing a leader does not undo structural evolution. The Republic did not snap back into place. It continued sliding forward because Caesar had already altered its center of gravity. If you look across the centuries that followed, you see rulers who consciously studied him, who measured their own authority against his trajectory, who sought either to emulate his decisiveness or avoid his overt symbolism. And in doing so, you realize that Caesar's ultimate conquest was not Gaul, nor Egypt, nor the Senate, it was precedent. He proved that a republic could be overtaken from within without formally declaring its end, that legality could be stretched until it redefined itself, that extraordinary powers granted during crisis could be extended through narrative, and that public loyalty, once attached to a person rather than a process, becomes a force capable of overwhelming tradition. Precedent, once established, is difficult to reverse. But perhaps the most unsettling dimension of his legacy lies in how understandable his motivations remain. He did not appear monstrous to his contemporaries, he appeared effective. He did not promise chaos, he promised order. He did not campaign on dismantling Rome, he campaigned on strengthening it. And therein lies the enduring lesson: systemic transformation often arrives disguised as improvement. Few leaders rise by declaring, "I will end the system." They rise by insisting, "I will fix it." Caesar fixed many things, and in fixing them, he reshaped everything. Imagine for a moment that he had survived the Ides, that the Parthian campaign proceeded, that further victories extended his legend, that reforms continued, that age eventually slowed him. What would Rome have become under a prolonged Caesarian reign? Would resentment have faded into acceptance? Would succession have been managed more smoothly? Or would concentrated authority have provoked even greater backlash later? We cannot know. What we do know is that his assassination froze him at peak intensity, preserving him as perpetual ascent rather than gradual decline, ensuring that history remembers him mid-stride, never fully tested by stagnation, never diminished by failure of later years. Death sealed the myth, and myths endure because they condense complexity into archetype. Caesar became the archetype of the transformative leader whose ambition outruns restraint, whose competence outpaces consensus, whose momentum compresses history into years rather than decades, and whose very success destabilizes the environment that produced him. He is neither purely warning nor purely inspiration. He is both, a testament to what singular will can accomplish, a reminder of what singular will can undo. When modern societies debate executive power, emergency authority, charismatic leadership, or institutional gridlock, Caesar hovers invisibly in the background, not because circumstances are identical, but because the structural tension remains familiar. How much concentration of power is tolerable in pursuit of stability, and at what point does stability become pretext for permanence? He lived at that boundary, he stepped across it, and the world adjusted. If we return once more to the boy in the Subura, aware of noble ancestry yet diminished relevance, we see the origin of the entire arc, an internal refusal to accept the gap between potential and position, a quiet decision that he would not inherit obscurity, that he would not be a footnote to greater men, that he would not allow Rome's future to unfold without his imprint upon it. Everything else followed from that refusal: the alliances, the debts, the wars, the reforms, the river, the knives. The empire. History often turns on structures, on economics, on geography, on demographic shifts, and Rome had all of those pressures. But sometimes history also turns on personality, on the specific configuration of ambition, intelligence, courage, and impatience housed within a single individual at precisely the moment a system is vulnerable to acceleration. Caesar was that configuration. He did not create Rome's instability. He converted it into transformation. And so we end not with a simple moral, but with a pattern that continues echoing through time. When institutions strain and ambition rises, when leaders believe themselves indispensable, when narratives justify escalation as preservation, when loyalty shifts from process to personality, when momentum feels irreversible, the die is already rolling. Caesar did not merely cast it, he embodied it, and once embodied, it carried Rome from republic to empire, from shared restraint to centralized permanence, from tradition to transformation. His life began as inheritance. It ended as inflection point, and in between, he demonstrated how far a single human being can push the boundaries of an entire civilization before those boundaries redraw themselves permanently.